in literature and a doctorate at the University of Michigan in the same field. In addition to church positions, Reverend Lyons was the director of the Walker and Gertrude Sisler Library at Wayne, a facility dedicated to the Holocaust and the study of the role of the churches during the Nazi period in Germany. Reverend Lyons has conducted research in Europe and Israel on the themes of the Holocaust, the church struggle in Nazi Germany, and on contemporary Jewish-Christian relations. He has traveled extensively in the Middle East, where he worked for Jewish-Christian studies in Southfield. The purposes of this ecumenical institute are to foster greater understanding between Jews and Christians, to combat theological and social anti-Semitism, and to provide opportunities for study and discussion of the issues which have often been sources of tensions and hostilities between Christians and Jews. Speaking on the topic of the Christian's view of Israel, I'd like to present to you Reverend James Lyons.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Great introduction. I should get a copy of that to send out.
You wrote it.
I wrote it, Israel is very special to me. I'm making, I don't know, my 22nd, 23rd trip there 3 weeks from today, leaving with a group of Christians to visit Israel and to share. We're working on a youth trip this summer where Christians and Jewish kids will spend some time together traveling in Israel, working for 2 weeks on one of the kibbutzim, spending time in the Sinai and sharing with one another, including joining up with some Israeli kids so that there will be a nice healthy balance. I think that Israel is very central to the understanding of the Jewish-Christian dialogue. And I won't go into the work of the Institute because it's been passed over very, very quickly, and yet succinctly when we talk about Jews and Christians, we're talking about 2,000 years of monologue at best. Jews and Christians are finally, for the first time in history, beginning to move beyond a monologue, mostly where Jews have been required to listen to Christians, through what I call a duologue, that is where we both had monologues at each other and oftentimes by each other, where Jews spoke to Christians and Christians spoke to Jews, but neither one paid much attention to what the other one was saying, to a real dialogue and a sharing. I think we've reached a point where we're not only concerned about what makes us the same, but we agree to be different, and to accept the differences, and to appreciate the differences, and to grow with it. So it's a very exciting time for me, because in the work of the Institute, we're bringing women's groups together, we're bringing youth groups together, and we're bringing clergy groups together to discuss things of common interest, including the things that hurt us. For Christians, theology is extremely important. I think one of the most interesting problems that Christian ministers have when dealing with rabbis, or Christian priests have when dealing with rabbis, is that they want to talk theology and rabbis sort of throw up their hand. I think, Rabbi, it's probably a good question. Do Jews have a theology in the sense that Christians do? And they probably don't. It's entirely possible for Christians to totally separate their feelings about how you live your life here with what you think about God. One of the great problems that we had during the Holocaust is that in Nazi Germany and in other countries, not only Germany, but it was other countries, France, Belgium, and the Eastern European countries, and even Holland, you had a real strong feeling that correct belief is the most important thing and how you live out your life is less important. Within Lutheranism, there's a doctrine of two kingdoms. You've got the kingdom of heaven, which you talk about God, and you've got the kingdom on earth where you live. And according to the doctrine, if you have the correct belief, you're established in the kingdom of heaven, and then you follow the powers on earth. And those powers sometimes can ask you to do very drastic kinds of things. For Judaism, that's not understandable at all. How can you believe something that you don't practice? And what you practice says more about your belief than any words. Is that an accurate statement? At least hopefully, right? For Christianity, that's not totally true. The second thing is that I'm going to be talking about some theological things, and I will try to avoid language that's specialized, but if I do something, throw up your hands and say, wait a minute. And third, I really only talk for a few minutes because I want to deal with questions and particularly give the kids a chance to ask whatever they ever wanted to ask a boy, but were afraid to. Nearly 1/3 of the time in the United Nations is spent on Israel. I speak probably more on Israel and the Middle East than any other particular subject. I speak 80% of the time to Christian groups. I no longer speak so much on Israel to Christian groups. I talk about the Middle East in general, because one of the things that shocks Christians is that Israel is not the center of the world, nor is it the center of the problems in the Middle East. When you begin to get people to look beyond Israel, Israel is put into a focus and into a lot of other things, and I think we forget it. You know, something happens in Lebanon, but the headline says Israel. Then down through it, they'll talk about Lebanon. Something happens in Syria, Israel views. And then they go on down through. The headlines always hit Israel, no matter what's going on in the Middle East, as though Israel is the central problem of the whole thing. You and I know differently. We know that the problems in Lebanon are problems that go way back, long before Israel was established, that the problems between the Druze and the Muslims and the Christians are historic problems as well as contemporary problems, that the struggle between Egypt and Libya has nothing to do with Israel, between Iran and Iraq has nothing to do with Israel, between Jordan and Syria has nothing to do with Israel, that Saudi Arabia has nothing to do with Israel. But nonetheless, all these things are put into the context of Israel. And I think one of our problems is that we don't understand it in a historical point of view, and we totally and completely lose sight of the fact that even the problem with the Palestinians is not the problem of Israel. You may want to ask about that. But I think for Jews who have a strong feeling for the land, they don't understand why some Christians are so anti-Israel while others are so pro, and what makes the difference, which is what I really want to talk about today. Let's talk about the antis first. In Christian theology, there's a concept that the old Israel, that is the Jewish people, has passed away, and the new Israel, that is the Christian people, is here. I recently wrote an article trying to deal with the theology of understanding God in both Judaism and Christianity. It was published in a magazine. I just got a semi-blistering letter where this individual says that the seed of Abraham are those who accept Jesus Christ and become the true Israel. Those who don't accept are condemned. That is the old-style, theological, anti-Semitism for which there is no biblical basis, but it's still being taught. If you have an old Israel that's passed away, how can you have a state called Israel established by Jewish people? You can't. Therefore, the state is wrong. That's it. Now, if you were to ask people that, they probably wouldn't be quite that honest and straightforward about it, but the fact of the matter is that the latent anti-Semitism comes in, works itself through, is not thought about, and becomes blatant when it becomes a question of the state of Israel. There is within much of Christian theology that the dispersion of the Jews throughout history is the direct result of them, the Jews, quotation marks, the Jews having killed Christ. If you read some of the catechisms, you will find in the teachings of the children that this terrible dispersion is a punishment of God. And if you have been dealing with that and teaching that and preaching that for 2,000 years, and suddenly you have this massive ingathering, what does that do to your theological state? So some are not sure that this is really God doing. There's a fellow by the name of Mike Evans. Some of you may see him on television. He's very pro-Israel. He's an evangelist, and the other night he had another evangelist on talking about how this evangelist said, I'm not anti-Semitic or anything like that, but you have to understand, he said, that the Jews always want everything. They always push themselves in where they're not wanted. They have stolen the land from the Arabs, the rightful Arabs. They have no right to come back to the land. But of course, I'm not anti-Semitic, he said. But part of that is a theological anti-Semitism that says the old has passed away, there's no room for it, and the dispersion, the spreading out of the Jews over all the countries has been the will of God. And that Jesus has made Judaism obsolete. I think one of the reasons that Christians try to, quote Christians, have tried to convert Jews for so long is that they really believe Judaism is obsolete, and therefore what's it still doing around? And if Judaism is obsolete, how do you have a, quote, Jewish state, whatever that means? I won't even touch that one. I'm not sure any of us can tell us what Israel means when we say it's a Jewish state, because there are Christians living there, there are Muslims living there, there are Baha'is living there. It's got a lot of mixture of things, but I'll let you worry about that. One of the things I run into as well, and it just amazes me, is that there are those who call Israel tribalism. The world today has no room for a tribalistic state. And when I ask the question, what do you mean by tribalism, they come back to this whole question of the Jewish state. There is no room for a state that has a state religion. I said, I'm willing to agree Egypt should go out. The official state religion of Egypt is Islam. I'm quite willing to agree Syria should be dismantled. The official state religion of Syria is Islam, as is Jordan, as is Saudi Arabia, as is Iran, as is Iraq, as is a whole host of other countries. And when you say that to somebody, they look at you in absolute amazement, and they say, what do you mean? I said, not only that, I'm willing to agree Spain should be put into the same category. We're into very recently, the official state religion in Spain was Catholicism. I was in Spain with a group of people. They showed us a synagogue very proudly, an old synagogue. We went to a Jewish bookstore. They were proud that there were Jews living in Spain. So I said to the guide, I'd like to worship Sunday in a Protestant church. And the guide laughed. I said, okay, you got me. It was illegal at the time, and that was just a few years ago. So consequently, people who are talking this way don't even know what they're talking about, but they throw it out and make you on the defensive. And if you don't know where they're coming from, it makes it very difficult to try to answer. And I think the last thing in theological anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism is now a new name, it's called anti-Zionism. When anybody starts off and says, I'm not anti-Semitic, but I'm anti-Zionist, I know that they don't know the difference between the two, because there ain't no difference between the two. Not in the Western world. Believe me. It is nicer to say you're anti-Zionist. It's nice to say that some of my best friends are Jews, but the but is very, very small. So I think the Christians who have not examined their own feeling, their own anti-Semitism, who have not dealt with themselves, it's very easy to say, I'm anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Semitic. After all, I belong to a clergy group, and there's a rabbi there, and they occasionally have lunch with us. You see, I can't be anti-Zionist because I have lunch with a rabbi. Big deal. I think there's a second area of support, both for and against Israel. And this is a double-edged sword. And that's the missionary work. You know, in Israel, there was very little missionary work done for a number of years. It's now beginning to grow. The same groups that are so supportive among the fundamentalists and the conservatives are also the most missionary-minded. And while some of them are willing to say we'll hold off missionary work and attempts at conversion to a later date, the fact of the matter is that it's growing in Israel and it's becoming a real problem. I've been going to Israel since 1967, and for all the years I've gone, I've never seen any real major problems until the last time I was there a year ago in October, and suddenly you're seeing signs, you're having all kinds of debates, because once this kind of a group gets in, while those who found it might somehow or another be willing not to do missionary work, they leave in very quickly. And there's strange things. You know, there's a thing called Brides for Jesus. It's located in Canada. The purpose is that you send young men to the kibbutzim in Israel, and they work there, and hopefully they will entice and fall in love with a young woman who will then convert in order to marry. I mean, that's obscene. Ridiculous. It's happening. Missionary has always worked very, very hard to convert. Christianity has always been a missionary religion, good, bad, or indifferent. I think we can talk about liberation theology, which is a theology that deals with the underdog. Israel was seen as the overdog and the underdog. I remember 2 years ago when the Lebanese war was on, I was in Israel and I was in Lebanon, and we had a meeting with Prime Minister Begin, and he, with that rare humor of his, sometimes gets lost in the midst of all of his professorial lecturing, with that rare humor of his, he said, you know, when Israel was founded, we were seen as the underdog. Now, I understand we're considered the fourth most powerful nation in the world. Militarily, we're seen as the overdog. It bothers me that we're always seen as a dog. And then there's a theological idealism that indeed, if this is the purpose of God in the world, shouldn't Israel live better than anybody else? And I must confess that the Israelis themselves have problems with this. And they struggle. Is Israel a normal nation? Is it like any other nation? Does it have the same problems, the same goals, the same hopes, the same dreams? Or is it something special? I think that those who go to Israel are amazed to find out that there are robbers and thieves and drunkards and other kinds of people who live in, quote, the Holy Land. We have both within Christianity and Judaism what I call religious land holy. That is, people who live whatever they want to in their own country, but suddenly when they arrive in Israel, they put on a kippah. Suddenly when they arrive in Israel, they carry a Bible if they're Christian. And they go to the holy sites, and they look upon it as the Holy Land. I cannot tell you the number of tours to the Holy Land that I see. Not Israel, to the Holy Land. And the whole question of in Lebanon and elsewhere, is there a higher standard of morality in Israel or not? Really debated. But I think it's a very real question that needs to be talked about. What about those who are so pro-Israel? I think there are a number of reasons for that very quickly, too. One of it is sheer romanticism. I can remember the first time I arrived in Israel. I was flying out of Paris, and there was a young gal sitting next to me. She must have been 15 or 16 years of age, French girl. My French was not so good that I wanted to take the risk of talking, and she didn't speak English, which I'd already asked about. So we rode in silence from Paris to Tel Aviv, Lod Airport, Ben Gurion, and we settled down, and the plane arrived. That was back in the days when El Al used to play Hatikva when you arrived in Israel. And it began playing the national anthem. As the plane sat down, tears were running down my eyes, and I looked over and tears were running down her eyes. And we reached out, this Jewish gal and this Christian minister, we reached out and we held hands and we cried. And there is something about Israel. I mean, when I go there, friends of mine say, you arrive, you're tired, you're boring, you look like you ought to be half dead, and 1 week later it's like your feet go down into the soil and you sprout and grow. It's true. There are all kinds of books in the footsteps of Jesus, in the footsteps of the prophets, and you walk the streets and you have these visions. And so there are those who support Israel because of the romanticism. There are those who support Israel because God blesses those who bless Israel. This is a biblical quotation, obviously, and there are many Christians who argue that way. I get all kinds of materials over my desk. One of the individuals who writes a little thing called The Hope, publishes it every month or so, talks about how the airport strikers the controllers went on strike, but Israel was not being blessed at that time by the United States because the United States was raising some questions about Israel. Therefore, all of the controllers went on strike and caused a terrible problem. The United States turned around and agreed that they ought to support Israel, and lo and behold, Libyan missiles were shot at American planes, and they miraculously missed the planes, which shows quite clearly to this individual that God blesses those who bless Israel. I don't think I need to say much more about that. Israel is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Israel is the bulwark against atheistic communism. I can remember in Lebanon talking to the soldiers there, and one of the things the soldier said to me is that oftentimes I think the problems in the Middle East have nothing to do with Jew and Arab, they have to do with American and Russian. And I have the feeling when I'm looking across the border at the Syrians that they're putting on a Russian uniform and I'm putting on an American uniform, and I wish both Russia and America would leave us alone and let us solve our own problems. But there are many Americans who see Israel as the only democratic, which it is, and therefore the only pro-West, which it is, government in the area, and therefore you support it because they're going to stop the communists in the area. Most frightening of all is that Israel must be established before the Messiah, blessed be he, can come. For Christians, the standard joke in Israel right now among Jews and Christians is when the Messiah comes, blessed be he, the first question is going to be, has he ever come before? And Christians are going to say, yes, Jesus came and fulfilled most of the prophecies, but Jesus is going to come back and fulfill all of them, and at that point, all Jews and all Christians will recognize Jesus as the Messiah. This is one of the theological things that's being said. It's called postponed eschatology or triumphalism, in the sense that ultimately you're all going to be Christians, but at that time there probably won't be any Christians or what have you. But before the Messiah can come, what has to happen? The state has to be established, and something even more frightening. You have to have the rebuilding of the temple. And there is in Israel today, both among Jewish circles and Christian circles, those talking about the destruction of the Dome of the Rock, which is in the site where the temple needs to be rebuilt, and And while I did not hear it with my own ears, a very good friend of mine, an Israeli guide, heard a Christian living in Israel pointing to with a group of Christian tourists and pointing to the Dome of the Rock and said, Jesus can't come again until the temple's built. One good rocket would take out that, and then we could help the Jews rebuild the temple. And I can give you 2 at least addresses in Israel where you can send money to help rebuild the temple when the time comes. They're collecting money for it. That's frightening. You see, one of the problems that you have with Mr. Reagan's, at least those who accuse him of it, Star Wars, and this whole movement towards destruction is that many of those who feel that they know the will of God decide that they'll make God's will happen. It doesn't matter whether you are Christian or Jewish. You know exactly what I'm talking about. There are those individuals who are so certain that they know what God wants that they're going to make it happen. One of my favorite books in the Bible is Jonah. Jonah is the life story of all of us. In the first chapter, Jonah is called by God to do something. We're all called by God to do something, and Jonah runs. Second chapter, Jonah gets in trouble. Swallowed by the whale in traditional things. By the way, there's a medieval Christian commentary that says Jonah was never swallowed by a whale. The whale was a pub in Joppa. Jonah went into it. After 3 days of drinking in the pub, they threw him out, and therefore he had this vision he had been in the bottom of the whale, but he really wasn't. I'm not going to talk about that. But Jonah then decides he ought to do something for God, and he runs to God, and he says, here I am, God. He's scared to death. And after God then allows him to do, he runs ahead of God and starts telling God what to do. Right? Listen, destroy them. What do you mean you're not going to destroy them? You pray to destroy them. And we've got in Christianity a very strong messianic kind of a people that will say if we can only destroy the holy mountain and clear everything off and build the temple, Jesus is going to come and Armageddon will take care of, and then the whole world. And that to me is frightening because I need not tell you of all people what would happen if some rocket were shot into the Dome of the Rock. It would give a whole new meaning to jihad, holy war. And it would not matter who did it. Well, there are a lot of other things we could talk about. I support Israel for one essential reason. I support Israel because I support Jews and the right of Jews to be who and what they are without outside interference. That may seem like a very strange reason. Oh, I have the romanticism. Oh, I think there's a biblical dimension. Oh, I think there's a moral dimension. I think all these things have something true. I don't think that Israel exists because of the Holocaust. I think Israel would have come into being without the Holocaust. I wish it had come into being without the Holocaust. Holocaust may have forced people to look a little differently, but the historical forces were moving that way. But I support Jews to be Jews as Jews and to govern themselves as Jews. For me, as I try to listen to Jews, there is a deep need to identify, particularly after the Holocaust, a place where a Jew can go and be Jewish. I can remember living in Israel for 3 months one summer. I was studying Hebrew. I was living in the Jewish section of Jerusalem. What a shock it was to me to walk out on a Saturday, which was just a day I was about ready to do some things, even though intellectually I knew, and find no transportation, to begin to observe the Sabbath. I found out how difficult it was to observe Sunday when all the shops were opening. Classes were oftentimes held on Sunday morning. Why? Because there had been something that interrupted. I came back with a new appreciation of how difficult it is for you to live in a Christian society, where you're bombarded with Christian views, with Christian symbols, with Christian kinds of things. And I think that one of the things I appreciated most about Israel and my stay there is it taught me, number one, what it's like to be a minority, even in a small way. Number two, how easy it is to lose who and what you are, because I am a Christian. And number three, to appreciate the kinds of need to have a place to identify that you can say, this is my homeland, even though I'm loyal where I live. It's a statement to me, a very real statement, because Yisrael Chai is proof that I'm Yisrael Chai. That to me is the most important statement of all. Okay, a lot of different things we can talk about, so let's do it.
Don't you think that every time there's an incident in the Middle East, the press always blows it up out of proportion and always blames Israel for everything that goes on over there.
I think one of the problems is the press doesn't know what it's doing. We now have experts on everything. If you are an international reporter in a plane, you are flying all over the place like crazy, you clock in. And I think there's some real problems on that. Peter Jennings, sitting at that time in London at the time the Lebanese war was going on, to which everything came on both sides, said that he was shocked when he actually went to Lebanon and saw how little destruction, for example, there was. He had been seeing things coming through and what have you. I think part of it's our problem. We don't demand. A recent Israeli journalist spent 12, 14 hours with camera people dealing with a segment of film that was really, he said, dynamite, but when he saw it on America, it was down to the typical minute and a half. We don't want to know why something happens, we show it. The famous burnt baby in Lebanon. Picture of it on President Reagan's desk to remind him of the horrors of what was going on. This little girl burnt over 90% of her body, near death. The Israelis were horrified. When they moved into Beirut, they chased this little girl down. They found that it wasn't a little girl, number one, it was a boy. Number two, was not burned over 90% of the body, had a little patch on the nose that was burned. And number three, that the child did have a broken arm, but the reason the child was wrapped is that in the Middle East, when you have a broken arm, you wrap the child to keep the arm from falling. So this terrible picture of the destruction of the Israelis and this burnt baby and everything else, and you've had the exhibit down at Wayne and elsewhere, the burnt baby exhibit, is phony. But how do you do it? Once it's on the air, once you've got it in the front pages, does it do any good 28 pages later, or 2 weeks later to say, well, sorry, it wasn't the right thing? The impact is there. Arafat kissing babies. But I got to tell you something. I spoke on Lebanon over and over and over and over again after the Lebanese incursion. And I spoke to Christian audiences, and I was talking about Arafat and the babies. And more people would come up and say to me, if I see another picture of Arafat kissing a baby, I'm going to throw up. That is not what it's all about. It's phony. There's a point where I think we have to recognize some of the sophistication of the audience. And the audience, I think, sometimes sees through these kinds of things. But yes, one other quick thing. Last spring, I listened to two speakers. One was a Syrian Orthodox priest, a Lebanese, and the other one was a journalist from Israel. I listened to them within 1 day of each other. Both the Syrian Orthodox priest and the man from Israel, the journalist, said, after 1 week in America, I no longer know what's going on in the Middle East. It's true. If I had my way, if I had the finances, I would spend a week or so every month at least, or every 2 months at the most, in the Middle East, reading, listening, following, because there you find out what's really going on. Once you're here, you're already separated. It's very difficult. But you know, we got a problem in our government too. Our government doesn't know what's going on in the Middle East. A friend of mine was called to Washington when the Ayatollah Khomeini took over the embassy in Iran. He was called to Washington to explain to the State Department what the Muslims were all about, what an Ayatollah was. What's the difference between the Shiite and the Sunnis? Here we've had an embassy, here we've been in the area for so long, and nobody ever sat down and said, what are the people we are working among like? Do you think they're any better in Israel? Do you think that the Americans have a better view, and I'm talking about official government, of what Israel is all about than what we read in the papers? I don't believe it. I don't think we have in our State Department anybody in a position of power who has the foggiest idea of the historical backgrounds of what's going on in the Middle East. I would like to be proven wrong, and if any of you can prove me wrong, I will say amen. But you and I both know that there's an awful lot of truth to what I'm saying. We have not developed people in our government who are willing to listen, to understand, and to do things. Let me give you a beautiful example. My favorite bookstore in Jerusalem was run by an Arab down just outside the Damascus Gate. I bought books there for years. It was the best theological bookstore in Israel. It's been sold there. I'd stay at hotels, and I'd walk by, and I'd stop off to see him and buy a book. Over a period of time, he got to know me. And in Arabic, you don't say Reverend Lyons, you say Reverend James. The Arabs all call me Reverend James. One morning I walked in after going for a number of years and buying a tremendous number of books there, and he would say, "Reverend James, would you like a cup of coffee?" And I said, "No, thank you. I just had coffee in the hotel, and I just want to look at the book." He didn't say anything. Next day I walked in, and he said, "Reverend James, would you like a cup of coffee?" And I said, "No, thank you. I just had coffee at the hotel. Thank you very much for the Third day I walked in and said, "Reverend James, would you like a cup of coffee?" I said, "No, thank you. I just had coffee at the hotel. Thank you. I just want to look at the books." And he looked at me and said, "Reverend James, you're too sensitive a man to know what you're doing to me, because when an Arab offers you coffee, he's offering you friendship." I turned around, I walked out the door, I turned around, I walked back in the door, and he said, "Good morning, Reverend James. Would you like some coffee?" I said, "You know, I'm going to have some coffee." Sat down, got coffee. We talked about him, his family, and a number of things. We became friends because he had offered it to me. The price of books went down because you deal differently with friends than you do with anybody else. True. Absolutely true. Suddenly the books, which were always a little expensive, were less expensive. And we talked eyeball to eyeball. Now that man taught me something about listening to others. And we do not listen. We make some terrible mistakes in the Middle East because we do not listen to the Israelis. We do not listen to the Arabs, Israelis as well as other Arabs. And we pay no attention. And the news people want to sell papers, and nothing on the national television news takes more than a minute and a half. And to show you our sense of priorities, we spent more time talking about a dog in Birmingham on the front page and regularly than we did about what was going on in much of the world during that period. I don't understand it, but then who am I to understand it? Anybody else? Yes? Misconceptions about what? Jews, Israel? You know, it depends on a lot of things. I'm struggling with it because I'm trying to categorize certain kinds of groups. Christian lay people are generally very, very open to Jews and to Israel. When I spoke about Israel coming back, and I talked about Lebanon, and I had been there, I'd been in Beirut, I had been in Tyre, I'd been in Sudan, we'd made the trip all the way up along the coastline. I came back and I talked about what I saw. On television you saw mass destruction. That is, that there was a regular path where the fighting went, but if you just turned your camera about 5 degrees, you picked up normality and regular living. So I talked about these things, and the overwhelming reaction at that point was, thank God I never believed the Israelis were or are what they're being portrayed on television. So if there is a genuine goodwill among most Christians, most, the ones who get upset with Arafat killing the babies. On the other hand, there is genuine ignorance of Christians about Jews, and you will forgive me, there is genuine ignorance of Jews about Christians. I'm teaching a course for the College of Jewish Studies, which is what I dare mention them, over at Temple Bethel. It's an adult education program for essentially 12 weeks. I have mostly Jews in it, but there are a number of Christians taking it. 4 individuals totally separately came up to me and said, you know, I'm finding out in this dialogue more about myself than I am about the other, but I'm also finding out an awful lot about the other. These are both Christians and Jews. I'm finding out how little I know about Judaism or how little I know about Christianity, but even more, I'm finding out about who and what I am. So that you still got Christians that believe Jews bury standing up. I don't know where that comes from. Maybe somebody can tell me. But that's still one of the things. You still got Christians that don't know what a beanie is. That's what they call it. They don't know what to call it. They don't know what to call it. And you see, you don't help any. I've heard Jewish kids call it a beanie. When I went to Mumford. Skull cap. I've heard Jewish kids call it all kinds of things. Very difficult for a Christian. The first time I went to a synagogue, I said, I'm going to listen very carefully, and I'm going to learn what you say. And I walked in, and the first guy said to me, Good Jan. I I said, thank you very much, and good Yontif. I walked up to the next person, I started to say good Yontif, he said, a good Shabbos. I said, a good Shabbos, what's a good Yontif, what's a good Shabbos? Next guy came up, said, a good Shabbat. A good Shabbat, and everyone said Shabbat Shalom. By the time I walked out of there, I didn't know whether you said hi or goodbye. Right? Depends on what you're doing. So you've got a lot of just plain misunderstanding, and people need to talk. Christians and Jews literally do not talk. It is a myth, men, that you know the Christian world. You know certain parts of the Christian world, but you don't know an awful lot of it. Because the things that are most essential to us, politics and religion, are the two things in America you can't talk about. So consequently, men that are dealing with Christians all the time and think they have some understanding really don't, because neither one talk very often about it. Now, I'm sort of wandering around your question because I think there's an awful lot of things depending on the Christians and upon the clergy. They don't understand your worship service until they sit down. Catholic Jewish worship services are so close together in many ways that if you were to lift out some of the Second Testament, or it's not New Testament, Second Testament readings and references to Jesus, you would think that you're in certain Jewish services. They read from the scriptures, they chant. I love the prayer at the meal. I think it's remarkable. One of the differences between Christians and Jews, I always say, is that Christians are always full of idealistic hope. We pray before the meal. Jews are very realistic. Let me taste it first, then I'll finish. There's something about that. I think Christians and Jews do not understand the fabric. We are still dealing with a lot of the false concepts that Judaism is legalistic. They don't understand what Torah is. They don't understand what even the concept of law is in Judaism. I think Judaism has problems with concepts of Trinity. 3 gods. No Christian believes in 3 gods. It's a problem. So part of what we see ourselves doing is trying to reach out and do some things and to understand some things so that people will talk about it one-to-one. It's very difficult. Jews are seen as pushy. Jews are seen as wealthy. Jews are seen as money grubbers. All the old stereotypes. I run into all of that. Those are things which are still part of the scene. And the problem with every prejudice is that no matter what the group is, there's always one person that fits it. The nature of prejudice is that I take the one person that fits my prejudice and I apply it to the whole group. That's what prejudice is all about. Okay, anybody else? Yes? And killing, the whole charge of deicide, that is the killing of Jesus or the Christ, the Oberammergau Passion play, which still goes on. Horrible. I saw it twice this summer. I went the first time to see it, and went back because I couldn't believe what I saw, and I wanted to make sure I really did see it. And have written about the Oberammergau Passion play. One of the greatest problems that Christians have is the old charge that the Jews are somehow responsible for the death of Jesus. And that comes down right to the present day, and the music a lot of other things are still reflective of it. We've got a real problem. When's the last time a new hymn has been written in Christianity? When's the last time one of the new cantatas has been written? What happens is that we are working very hard, not only we, but the National Catholic Bishop's Office has a full-time man, Dr. Eugene Fisher, with a PhD in Jewish Christian Studies and background, who is fluent in Hebrew, and who has worked with and continues to work with many, many fine Jewish scholars in order to review and to read every single piece of Catholic teaching material that's being developed, so that you're no longer moving in that direction, but then you suddenly go and you get the old hymns, and you get the old cantatas, and you get the old Easter thing. And it's not only Easter. One of the most beautiful hymns sung at Christmas time in virtually every church in the world is O Come, Emmanuel. Redeemed, captive Israel. lonely, broken, waiting for the Son of God. And I walked in, and in the church I happened to be serving, I saw that there, and I blew a conniption fit, because I hadn't chose the hymns, and said, we will sing this hymn without singing the first verse, which is what that's all about. After that, it's not so bad. You're right. You're absolutely right. So on one hand, we stand up and we talk about these things, and I preach about them, and on the other hand, our hymns and our cantatas and a lot of other things still show teaching of contempt of hatred. Something we have to fight on. People at Oberammergau, quite honestly, said openly that you look upon this as a religious experience that was originally, but now it's a financial experience. 500,000 people paid $40 a ticket to see the Oberammergau Passion play, and not only did they pay $40 a ticket, but they usually stayed overnight, they eat meals there, and who knows how many souvenirs, wood carvings, and everything else they brought back with them. It's atrocious, and so the fighting that's going on is bad. One positive thing, and I totally agree with you. One positive thing is that the battle on these things is now being engaged by Christians, not just Jews. Christians are finally beginning to speak up. Too long, too late, but at least it's happening. I do a course, for example, on Who Killed Jesus. And there's a book by that, What Killed Jesus, Ellis Rifkin, in which I finished the whole class with a dramatic presentation of Pontius Pilate appearing before the Roman Senate. And Pontius Pilate justifies why he put Jesus to death as a Roman, which is clear from the scriptures, the Christian scriptures. But the fact of the matter is, you got one little verse in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, that makes everything so difficult. His blood be upon our heads and our children's heads forever, and that's the one that keeps coming up. We've got some hard work to do. But it's being done slowly. Yeah? The concept of original sin, which is very basic to most of Christianity. And remember that Christianity has you guys have three major directions. You can have the Hasidic, and you can have the Reconstructionists, and Sherwin-Williams, humanism, and all that sort of stuff. But there are all kinds of things like that. Last time I counted 10 years ago, I just haven't been interested enough to do it, there were 214 different kinds of Baptists. In America, 214 different kinds of Baptists. It's only one of the denominational groups. So Christianity is broad. It's got everything in it, even as Judaism does. But one of the concepts of original sin is that because Adam and Eve sinned, sin entered the world, and all of us are inheritors of sin. The fact is in Webster Christianity that the very sexual act is a sinful act, and you are conceived in sin. And once you are a sinner, you have to be redeemed from that if you are going to be before God. As I understand Judaism, you come into the world sort of with a clean slate and you earn your own sins. And you go through a Yom Kippur, atonement, and all of that. But in Christianity, you are born in sin, you are sinful by nature, and you need to be purified. And the way you are purified is by accepting Jesus as the one who gave the final sacrifice. Very much Old Temple ritual. That is, you had to have a sacrifice for sin. Jesus, as the perfect sacrifice, became the one, if you accept it, cleanses you forever. What is baptism? Baptism has two things to do with it. There are two types of baptism. There are actually three kinds, but one of them is as a child and one of them is as an adult. The child is baptized because that cleanses you immediately from the original sin, symbolic of the cleansing. And confirmation, which is at the time of the bar mitzvah, about 13 or thereabouts, you confirm what was done to you as a child. In certain circles, like the Baptist, you are, until the age of 12 or 13, adulthood, you are ignorant and not responsible, but you become responsible at the time that you accept Jesus and become a Christian and are baptized. And then from there on in, you're responsible activities. And some it's an actual cleansing, and others it's a symbol.